In the world of American justice, some stories end not with redemption, but with a final walk to the execution chamber. Tonight, we're stepping behind the headlines to retrace the paths that led 4 prisoners to their last moments on death row. From chilling crimes and relentless investigations to quiet confessions and final meals, each case offers a window into the darkest corners of human choice. Which story will linger with you long after the last word is spoken? Michael Anthony Tansey. On that April evening at 6:12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Florida State Prison chamber door quietly closed behind Michael A. Tansey as the final chapter of a 25-year-old horror reached its grim conclusion by lethal injection. In April 2000, then 23-year-old Tansey ambushed 49-year-old Janet Acosta, a Miami Herald production supervisor, during her lunch break in Miami. He forced himself into her van, bound and gagged her, brutally assaulted and robbed her, then drove her toward the Florida Keys. Along the way, he forced her to withdraw cash. In a cold, secluded stretch near Cudjoe Key, he strangled her to death, abandoning her body in the mangroves. He later confessed to killing another woman in Massachusetts, but was only charged for Acosta's abduction, sexual battery, robbery, kidnapping, and first-degree murder. Within months, Tansey entered a guilty plea. A Florida jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. Governor DeSantis signed his execution warrant on March 10, 2025. His final appeals, claiming his morbid obesity and sciatica could render lethal injection cruel, were rejected by both state and U.S. Supreme Courts for being untimely and meritless. Tansey's final meal was ordered with clinical precision: a fried pork chop, crispy bacon, a baked potato, corn, a candy bar, ice cream, and a soda. He shared some of this with his spiritual advisor, his sole visitor. As the lethal cocktail coursed through his veins, Tansey mustered a faint voice. "I want to apologize to the family of Janet Acosta and Caroline Holder for taking their lives. Heavenly Father, please do not blame those who do not know what they're doing." He closed with the words of Luke 23:34, seeking mercy even in his final breath. The 3-drug protocol was administered under the scrutiny of medical and corrections staff. Witnesses say Tansey's chest rose and fell for 3 agonizing minutes. A guard shook him. There was no response. At 6:12 p.m., a heavy silence fell over the room. His life ended by lethal injection. The room exhaled as one. Nearly a quarter-century after that lunch break abduction, justice by the state's measure was served. Michal Mahdi. On a quiet spring evening, the air at Broad River Correctional Institution in South Carolina was heavy with anticipation. Michal Dean Mahdi, age 42, walked his final steps into the stark, fluorescent-lit chamber at precisely 6:01 p.m. Mahdi had chosen the firing squad, a method rarely used in modern America, but revived after years of legal delays and drug shortages. His decision was not made lightly. Given a choice between the electric chair, lethal injection, and the firing squad, he reportedly told his lawyers he chose the lesser of 3 evils, haunted by visions of burning or suffocating slowly. Instead, he faced the wall, a black hood pulled down over his head, a target pinned to his chest, and 3 anonymous volunteers with rifles hidden behind a partitioned wall. Mahdi's path to this moment began more than 2 decades earlier, in 2004. He embarked on a violent spree starting in Virginia, stealing a pistol and a car, then traveling south. He killed a convenience store clerk in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, without warning or mercy. Days later, in South Carolina, he ambushed Captain James Myers, an off-duty police officer, shooting him multiple times in his own workshop before setting the body and the building ablaze. The crime shocked law enforcement, especially since Myers was a father, husband, and a respected community member. Mahdi was caught after another short-lived escape, and his subsequent behavior behind bars, plotting to attack correctional officers, cemented the jury's resolve for the death penalty. In the hours before his execution, Mahdi received a last meal of ribeye steak, mushroom risotto, broccoli, collard greens, cheesecake, and sweet tea. He declined to make a final statement, offering no words to the family members, witnesses, or the world beyond the bulletproof glass. At 6:01 p.m., the order was given. 3 rifle shots rang out, echoing through the chamber. Mahdi's body jerked as bullets struck his chest. He let out a sharp cry. His arms tensed, and for nearly 80 seconds, witnesses watched him struggle, an agonizing silence that some later called botched. 2 bullets had missed his heart, prolonging his death and reigniting debates about the humanity of firing squads. At 6:05 p.m., a prison doctor declared him dead, closing a brutal chapter, but leaving new questions in its wake. Moises Sandoval Mendoza. By 6:40 p.m., CDT, inside the quiet, sterile walls of the Huntsville unit in Texas, Moises Sandoval Mendoza, 41, faced his end by lethal injection. His journey to that gurney began more than 2 decades earlier and was rooted in a crime that shattered not just one family, but an entire community. In March 2004, Mendoza targeted Rochelle O'Neal Tolson, a 20-year-old woman from his own high school in Farmersville, Texas. That night, he broke into her home, abducted her, and committed acts of violence so unspeakable that even seasoned investigators were shaken. After strangling and stabbing Rochelle, Mendoza attempted to erase his crime by burning her body and hiding it in a field miles away. It would take days for searchers to find her, and months for her family to piece together what had happened. The trial was swift. By July 2005, Mendoza was sentenced to death, with the jury unanimous in its decision. Over the years, he filed numerous appeals, arguing ineffective counsel and seeking mercy from higher courts, but each plea was denied, including his final appeals to the Supreme Court. When the day of reckoning arrived, Mendoza's demeanor was strikingly calm. There was no elaborate last meal. Since 2011, Texas no longer honors special meal requests for death row inmates. Instead, he spent his final moments focused on those left behind. Looking through the glass at Rochelle's grieving family, Mendoza offered words unexpected in their sincerity. "I am sorry for having robbed you of Rochelle's life. I know nothing that I could ever say or do would ever make up for that. I want you to know I am sincere. I apologize. Thank you for being here today." He turned softly in Spanish to his loved ones. "I love you. I am with you. I am well and at peace." As the 3-drug cocktail entered his veins, the room fell silent. 19 minutes later, the warden pronounced him dead. There was no celebration, only a quiet ending to a story marked by heartbreak. James Osgood. On the evening of April 24, 2025, a decade of appeals and courtroom drama came to a close in the execution chamber at Holman Correctional Facility, Alabama. James Osgood, age 55, had spent more than 10 years on death row, his fate sealed by the horrifying murder of Tracy Brown, a crime that shattered a small community and left investigators and family members scarred by its brutality. The story began on a quiet morning in October 2010, when Tracy Brown didn't show up for work. The welfare check that followed led to a scene so violent that even veteran officers paused. Tracy's body was found in her mobile home, her throat slashed, her back covered in stab wounds, evidence of a struggle that lasted nearly an hour. The investigation quickly zeroed in on Osgood, her boyfriend, and Tanya Van Dyke, Tracy's cousin. After a series of interrogations and confessions, it became clear that the killing was premeditated, marked by a twisted fantasy and chilling cruelty. The jury convicted Osgood of capital murder, citing the combination of sexual assault, torture, and a calculated effort to cover up the crime. On death row, Osgood filed appeals, claiming errors in jury instructions and ineffective counsel. When offered a new sentencing hearing, he declined, stating that he believed in an eye for an eye and deserved to die. In the days before his execution, he spent time with family and friends, refusing a special last meal but eating pizza with visitors. As he lay strapped to the gurney, Osgood's final words broke years of silence. "Tracy, I apologize." He made hand gestures of love to his family before the drugs began to flow. At 6:35 p.m., James Osgood was pronounced dead, his final chapter written in the quiet aftermath of justice served. Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson. On a humid Florida evening, the gates of Florida State Prison near Stark closed behind Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson, age 62, as he lay strapped to the gurney. Hutchinson, a Gulf War veteran, faced his end by lethal injection at 8:15 p.m., closing the book on a crime that had shaken a quiet Northwest Florida community. On September 11, 1998, Hutchinson massacred his live-in girlfriend, Renee Flaherty, 32, and her 3 children, 9-year-old Jeffrey, 7-year-old Amanda, and 4-year-old Logan, in their Crestview home. Armed with a Mossberg shotgun, he executed them in cold blood, later calling 911 to confess, "I just shot my family," a moment Nolan investigators never forgot. Convicted in 2001, Hutchinson received 3 death sentences, 1 for each child, and life for the murder of Flaherty. His defense cited Gulf War syndrome and mental illness, claiming diminished responsibility. All appeals were rejected by the Florida Supreme Court, federal courts, and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court, which dismissed his final plea without comment. Hutchinson eschewed ceremony, no special last meal. The state served him a standard tray: salmon, mahi-mahi, asparagus, baked potato, and iced tea. He spoke no final words, declining further communication beyond his earlier confession. As the lethal cocktail flowed through his veins, the chamber fell silent. At 8:15 p.m., Hutchinson's life ended, flatlined on the monitor, confirming the state's final judgment. His execution marked the 4th in Florida that year and underscored lingering controversies over mental illness, military trauma, and the death penalty. Glenn Edward Rogers. At 6:16 p.m., inside Florida State Prison near Stark, Glenn Edward Rogers, age 62, received the lethal cocktail that would end his life. Dubbed the Casanova Killer and Cross-Country Killer, Rogers was a convicted serial murderer whose crimes spanned multiple states and shocked a nation. Rogers began his killing spree in 1995. He murdered Tina Marie Cribbs, 34, in a Tampa motel room, stabbing her to death, and strangled Sandra Gallagher, 33, in California weeks later. He was convicted in both states and sentenced to death. Prosecutors linked him to up to 70 killings, although only 2 were proven in court. Despite long-standing claims of severe childhood trauma and challenges to lethal injection protocols, Rogers's appeals failed. The Florida Supreme Court denied stays, and the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final plea the day before his execution. He requested a modest final meal, pizza, chocolate cake, and soda, an unassuming choice for a man labeled a charismatic killer. Speaking through the pain, Rogers addressed victims' families, offered a cryptic promise of future answers, and then unexpectedly praised former President Trump. "President Trump, keep making America great. I'm ready to go." At 6:16 p.m., the 3-drug protocol began. Rogers lay still, his breathing shallow. A staffer gently shook him, calling his name. Minutes later, the monitor flatlined. The warden pronounced him dead. As Florida's 5th execution of the year, his death revived debate over unproven murder confessions, media sensationalism, and death row ethics, leaving more questions than closure. Benjamin Ritchie. On the evening of May 20th, 2025, as the sun set behind the limestone walls of Indiana State Prison, Benjamin Ritchie entered the execution chamber for what would be the last act in a story that began nearly 2 decades earlier. Ritchie, 51, was convicted of the 2005 murder of Indianapolis police officer Jake Laird, a killing that sent shockwaves through the city and galvanized public debate about policing and violence. It was August 18, 2004, when Ritchie, described by friends as troubled and unpredictable, erupted in anger at his home. After firing multiple rounds from a rifle, he set his house on fire before fleeing. Officer Laird, responding to the call, was ambushed by Ritchie, who opened fire, striking Laird fatally and injuring several others before surrendering. The city mourned Laird as a hero, and his death led to changes in state laws regarding firearms and mental health intervention. Ritchie's trial was swift. Prosecutors focused on the calculated nature of the ambush, arguing for capital punishment. Defense attorneys raised issues of mental illness and emotional instability, but the jury unanimously recommended death. Over the years, Ritchie filed numerous appeals citing ineffective counsel and mental health claims, but all were rejected at both state and federal levels. On his final day, Ritchie requested a last meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, corn on the cob, and a slice of apple pie. In his final statement, he offered an apology to the Laird family and expressed remorse, stating, "I wish I could take it back. I hope you find peace." At 6:09 p.m., the 3-drug cocktail was administered. The warden pronounced him dead at 6:20 p.m., closing the book on a tragedy that changed a community forever. Matthew Johnson. Under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights at Huntsville's Walls Unit, Matthew Johnson, age 47, lay motionless as officials prepared for Texas's 4th execution of the year. Johnson's journey to death row began with the July 2006 murder of convenience store clerk Linda Tran in Houston, a crime that, while unplanned, unfolded with brutal speed and lasting consequences. On that humid summer night, Johnson entered Tran's store just before closing, intent on robbing the register. When Tran resisted, Johnson struck her with a metal bar, leaving her fatally wounded before fleeing the scene. The incident was caught on security cameras, and within days, Johnson was arrested. The city grieved Tran's death, remembering her as a hard-working mother and beloved member of the neighborhood. Johnson's trial was marked by overwhelming evidence, including DNA, fingerprints, and his own confession. The jury handed down a death sentence in 2007, His appeals focused on procedural errors and claims of a difficult childhood, but the courts found no grounds for mercy. His execution was scheduled after nearly 18 years of litigation. For his last meal, Johnson chose a cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate milkshake, simple comforts echoing the life he never found. His final words, spoken with a trembling voice, were directed to Tran's family. "I am sorry for your pain. I hope you find healing." As the drugs took effect, Johnson closed his eyes. At 6:29 p.m., the warden pronounced him dead. The room fell silent, a final, somber note in a case that left scars on all it touched. Oscar Franklin Smith. On May the 22nd, 2025, at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Oscar Franklin Smith, aged 73, became Tennessee's oldest executed prisoner. Smith's journey to death row began on a spring night in 1989 when his estranged wife, Judy Smith, and her two teenage sons, Chad and Jason Burnett, were brutally murdered in their Nashville home. Prosecutors argued that Smith, driven by anger over a bitter divorce, had meticulously planned the attack, shooting, stabbing, and bludgeoning the victims in a spree of violence that shocked the community. Smith maintained his innocence throughout 3 decades of appeals, even as courts repeatedly upheld his conviction. Defense attorneys cited new forensic evidence, including questions about a fingerprint found at the scene, but those claims failed to convince the courts. Supporters campaigned for a stay, but Tennessee's governor and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. On his final day, Smith's last meal request was straightforward: fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, coleslaw, and a slice of pecan pie. When offered the chance for final words, he declared, "I am innocent. I did not kill my family." At 7:02 p.m., the warden signaled the start of the lethal injection. Smith closed his eyes and took several deep breaths before falling silent. At 7:15 p.m., he was pronounced dead, ending a long, controversial chapter that left lingering doubts and unanswered questions for both his family and the state. Anthony Wainwright. On June 10, 2025, the long-delayed execution of Anthony Floyd Wainwright finally came to pass within the austere walls of Florida State Prison. At 59, Wainwright had spent nearly 3 decades on death row, a life defined by the single crime that shocked a state and devastated a family: the 1994 abduction and murder of 23-year-old Carmen Gayhart. The tragedy began on April 27, 1994, in Lake City, Florida. Carmen Gayhart was a young mother and beloved daughter, heading to the grocery store when her path fatally crossed with Wainwright. Armed and desperate after a string of crimes with an accomplice, Wainwright and an accomplice forced Carmen into her car at gunpoint, intending only a quick escape. But the abduction soon turned brutal. Wainwright drove Carmen out to a secluded wooded area. There, they bound her, sexually assaulted her, and ultimately strangled her with a nylon cord. He left her body in the woods and fled the state, sparking a multi-state manhunt. Investigators pieced together the evidence swiftly. DNA and fibers linked Wainwright to the crime, and he was arrested with his accomplice in Mississippi. Extradited to Florida, he was tried for first-degree murder, kidnapping, robbery, and sexual battery. The jury's verdict was unequivocal: death. Years of appeals followed, citing issues of mental health and legal representation, but every court upheld the sentence. For Carmen's family, every delay meant reopening wounds that never healed. On execution day, Wainwright requested a final meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, and pie, perhaps the only comfort allowed. Before the drugs began, he looked toward the victim's family and spoke softly, "I am sorry for all the pain I caused. I hope you find peace." At 6:14 p.m., with the last words still echoing, the warden pronounced Anthony Floyd Wainwright dead. Justice, at last, brought a quiet but somber close to a story of profound loss. Gregory Hunt. On June 10, 2025, at the Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, a solemn hush settled over the chamber as Gregory Hunt, aged 65, became one of the first inmates executed there, and the sixth in the nation, by nitrogen hypoxia, a new method sharply dividing legal and moral opinion. Hunt was convicted in 1990 for the August 2, 1988 murder of Karen Lane, 32, a woman he had dated for about a month. Prosecutors said a jealous, rage-fueled confrontation culminated in a gruesome attack inside Lane's Walker County apartment. She was sexually assaulted and beaten, suffering more than 60 separate injuries. Decades of appeals followed, many raising concerns about evidence reliability and Hunt's mental state, claims ultimately dismissed by Alabama courts and the U.S. Supreme Court. Hunt had selected nitrogen hypoxia when the state authorized it in 2018, and his final clemency plea was denied mere hours before the execution. On execution day, Hunt declined the traditional special meal, opting only for a standard lunch tray of bologna, black-eyed peas, carrots, and fruit punch. As a blue-rimmed mask was fitted over his face, he addressed witnesses with silent gestures, reportedly a peace sign and thumbs up, then fell into stillness. The nitrogen flowed at approximately 5:55 p.m., and within minutes Hunt showed signs of distress, shaking, moaning, and brief gasps, continuing until around 6:05 p.m. The chamber fell into a tense quiet. At 6:26 p.m., the warden pronounced him dead. The execution reopened fierce debate over whether nitrogen asphyxiation can truly be humane, a method that leaves both supporters and critics with haunting questions of conscience and justice. John Fitzgerald Hansen. On June 12, 2025, a long-awaited moment arrived at Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, where John Fitzgerald Hansen, also known as George John Hansen, was executed by lethal injection. At 61, Hansen faced the weight of a crime committed a quarter-century earlier, a violent carjacking and double murder that left a community haunted. In August 1999, Hansen and an accomplice kidnapped 77-year-old Mary Agnes Bowles, a retired Tulsa banker, from a mall parking lot. They drove her to a remote dirt pit near Owasso. There, Hansen shot her 4 to 6 times at close range, then fled. While at the scene, his accomplice also shot and mortally wounded bystander Gerald Thurman, who had witnessed the abduction. Arrested a week later after robbing a credit union, Hansen was tried and convicted in 2001. The jury recommended death for Mrs. Bowles's murder and life without parole for Mr. Thurman's, citing the calculated nature of the crime. Decades of appeals followed. Hansen initially served time in federal prison, then was transferred to Oklahoma in 2025, following policy changes made possible by executive orders and the reversal of prior federal refusals. On execution day, Hansen declined a special meal, accepting the standard tray: chicken pot pie, rolls, fruit cups, and carrots. He offered no public statement, but in the chamber, several witnesses said they heard him murmur, "Forgive me, peace to all." At 10 a.m., the drugs were administered. By 10 a.m., the monitor flatlined. At 10:11 a.m., the warden pronounced Hansen dead, the end of a case defined by calculated violence, prolonged litigation, and lingering moral questions about justice and time. Stephen Christopher Stanko. On a humid Friday evening at Broad River Correctional Institution near Columbia, South Carolina, Stephen Christopher Stanko, age 57, walked into the execution chamber for the second time in his life, this time receiving lethal injection. His final act closed a grim story of double homicides and enduring trauma. In April 2005, Stanko went on a violent rampage. On the night of April 7th, he strangled 43-year-old Laura Ling, his girlfriend, inside her Murrells Inlet home, while also raping and slitting the throat of her teenage daughter, who managed to survive and call 911. The following day, in Conway, he turned on 74-year-old Henry Lee Turner, a friend, shooting him twice and stealing his truck. The dual crimes shocked two small communities, sparking a multi-jurisdictional manhunt that ended with Stanko's arrest in Georgia during the Masters tournament. Convicted for both murders, along with kidnapping, armed robbery, and sexual assault, Stanko received 2 death sentences in separate trials, 2006 and 2009. He spent nearly 2 decades on death row before a clemency plea was denied in May 2025. Initially, considering the firing squad, he switched to lethal injection after learning details of a problematic execution 2 months earlier. For his final meal, Stanko requested seafood and southern sides, fried fish, fried shrimp, crab cakes, baked potato, carrots, fried okra, cherry pie, banana pudding, and sweet tea. Moments before his death, he delivered a prepared statement, speaking for 3.5 minutes. "I have lived for approximately 20,973 days, but am judged solely for 1. Once I'm gone, I hope that Laura's family and Henry's family can all forgive me. The execution may help them. Forgiveness will heal them." At 6:06 p.m., the IVs were started. Shortly after, correctional staff noted labored breathing and mouth movements. A second dose of pentobarbital was given about 13 minutes later. At 6:34 p.m., the warden pronounced him dead, 28 minutes after the process began. Stanko was the 6th person executed in South Carolina over 9 months. His execution, a stark conclusion to a horrifying sequence of violence, renewed intense debate over capital punishment and the burden placed on victims' families, survivors, and society at large. The stories behind these executions are reminders of the irreversible consequences of violence, both for the victims and for those who commit such acts. Each case leaves behind a legacy of pain, questions, and, for some, a sense of justice served. As the doors to the execution chambers close and the headlines fade, the impact of these tragedies remains etched in memory. If these accounts made you reflect, consider sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that reveal the human side of justice.